Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's 1 o'clock, so it's time to start today's proceedings. My name is Keith Fox. I'm the director of the Faraday Institute in Cambridge, and these seminars we hold every other Tuesday during the university term. So it's a pleasure today to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Stuart Mathieson. He has a first degree in history and philosophy and an MA in history from Queen's Belfast, and he is interested in the intersection of science, religion and philosophy. He's currently working on a Leverhulme Trust funded project on fundamentalism as an Ulster phenomenon, and he's doing that in collaboration with Dr. Andrew Holmes and Professor David Livingstone. His doctoral research, which was funded by the AHRC, investigated the Victoria Institute, and I think he'll be telling us more about that today. He's now based in City University in Dublin, although I think he's still living in Belfast, at least especially during the current lockdown. So his talk today is on an evangelical philosophy of science from Bacon and Paley to Stokes. Stuart, it's a pleasure to welcome you, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor and a privilege to speak to the Faraday Institute. I should actually be in Cambridge now researching for my current project, so it's nice to be there, if not in person, then virtually. So I'm just going to share my PowerPoint here, and I will start the presentation. So I suppose I'll just say a little bit about myself by way of introduction. I've just started a new project, actually. I'm the Government of Ireland postdoctoral fellow at Dublin City University, and I'm going to look at the religious life of the 19th century physicist Sir George Gabriel Stokes. And before that, I just finished the research project that Keith described there, looking at historical evangelicalism and fundamentalism in Ulster. But what I'm really interested in, and what I try to build my research around, is the object of the Faraday Institute, the relationship between science and religion. Now, as an historian, I'm mostly interested in the historical relationship, but I think that understanding the history is actually particularly important for understanding any contemporary debates. And to explain what I mean, I'll just sketch a little bit of the contemporary background for you. Now, I suppose I've always been interested in the relationship between science and religion, but what got me particularly interested and want to pursue it academically and look at the historical relationship was a book I read maybe 12 or 13 years ago now. So in the mid-2000s, there was quite a lot of attention paid to the influence of what we might call conservative religious thought on politics. The events of September 11th had brought Islamic fundamentalism into public focus, but Christian and specifically conservative evangelical Protestant thought, what's sometimes called fundamentalism, drew a lot of attention as well. And actually, many commentators suggested that the American president, George W. Bush, who was a teetotal Methodist, a daily Bible reader, a very sincere and devout Methodist by all accounts. But some political commentators suggested that actually, if not as a fundamentalist, he would be sympathetic to the introduction of what might be thought of as fundamentalist politics. And one particular example of how this controversy erupted between fundamentalism and science in American politics came in 2005, so at the beginning of the second Bush term, with the Kitzmiller versus Dover Area School District trial, sometimes called the Intelligent Design trial. And this was basically a ruling by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that intelligent design was a religious rather than a scientific position, and that the Dover School Board had violated the First Amendment by requiring it to be taught in its biology classes. And a couple of years later, the Young Earth Creationist group, Answers in Genesis, led by Ken Ham, opened the Creation Museum in Kentucky, northern Kentucky, actually just south of the Ohio border. And it gained a measure of infamy when it was featured in Bill Maher's anti-religious polemic film, Religulous. And they've since gone on to open the Ark Encounter on an adjacent site, which is a full-scale replica of Noah's Ark, complete with dinosaurs on board. Now, here in Northern Ireland, there's also something of an intimate relationship between politics and religion that is spilled into how science is communicated in the public sphere. And in fact, Ken Ham has frequently toured here and given sold-out talks at the Waterfront Hall in Belfast. It's a 2,000-seat arena, and it usually hosts touring comedians, established bands, those kind of people. Now, around this time, many members of Northern Ireland's largest party, the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, thanks to local and contemporary politics, I don't have to explain who the DUP are anymore when I talk about them to an English audience, which is quite nice. But they were members of a group called the Caleb Foundation, and this was essentially a pressure group. And one of the things that they wanted really to focus on was creationism in the public sphere. So the then Culture Minister, Nelson McCausland, wrote to local museums, including the Ulster Museum, which is sort of our national museum, asking them to display creationist material alongside signage that suggested that the Earth was millions of years old. So he wanted, besides geological explanations, also young Earth creationist material. And then in 2010, a similar thing happened when the Giant's Causeway Centre was redeveloped by the National Trust. He wrote and campaigned to have that involved. But what's really interesting, I think, is that there's a link between this and other positions that we might think of as just anti-science, such as climate change denial. So another DUP minister, Sammy Wilson, who was the environment minister at the time, was a strong skeptic of climate change and branded global warming adverts, he banned global warming adverts from being played on local television. So all of this was going on in the background. I was very interested in politics, and I was very interested in what the relationship seemed to be between science, religion, and politics. And I wasn't the only person. There was a sort of boom in interest about that relationship, and a lot of it seemed to center on scientific issues. And one big voice in those debates was the biologist Richard Dawkins, who was associated with the movement that later became known as the New Atheists or New Atheism. Now, as an aside, as an historian of the subjects, I don't think there was much new in what they were saying or doing. But anyway, Dawkins, along with the journalist Christopher Hitchens, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, and Sam Harris, who I suppose inhabit a sort of grey zone in between cognitive science, philosophy, and polemics, became the main faces of this movement. And they wrote best-selling books and generated a lot of media controversy and so forth. I read some of this work and I wasn't overly impressed, but a friend absolutely insisted that I read The God Delusion by Hawkins. And as I was reading, quite early on in the introduction, I noticed that Dawkins had included a quote from the author Robert Pirsig, who you might know as the author of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And this said, when one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion. Now, essentially, Dawkins built this viewpoint into his thesis, and he argued that one reason why Christians rejected evolution was because they held contradictory beliefs that were functionally equivalent to a delusion or a mental illness. Now, needless to say, and I don't think I'll be saying anything controversial to this audience, I find this deeply, deeply unsatisfying, actually very insulting. Now, as I've highlighted, there are areas, and there still are, points of conflict, particularly about evolution, but this caricature didn't really seem to fit very many of the evangelicals that I knew, and especially the very many evangelical scientists that I knew. And in fact, this is still going on. After I wrote this seminar, I've just included this slide because the president of Humanists UK, Professor Alice Roberts, was on Twitter making very similar arguments equating religious faith with psychosis. This is just from 2 days ago. So I find these kind of explanations, these kind of analysis, if you can call it analysis, very unsatisfying. And I decided to look into the history a bit more closely. How did evangelicals react to evolution when Darwin proposed his theory? Was there always conflict? Could I draw a straight line between then and now? So although I'm an historian, I want to understand if there's a link between the original response to Darwin and the debates that we see in the present day. And particularly what I want to understand is if the conflict thesis, that is this idea pushed by Dawkins and the new atheists that science and religion are separate, that they're mutually irreconcilable, that they're always at odds, locked in warfare, and so on, and which has become a commonplace in a lot of contemporary discourse, like we saw with the Alice Roberts quotes on Twitter, if this actually had a historical basis. And one of the first things that I found out was that there's actually quite a lot of very, very good historical and philosophical research, and almost all of it rejected the conflict thesis. And in fact, what's really interesting is that the conflict thesis itself was really codified around the time of Darwin by two writers, sort of historians, called John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White. And they had a sort of political and religious message of their own that they wanted to promote. But when I got a little bit deeper into my own research, I looked at an evangelical organization set up ostensibly to oppose Darwin, called the Victoria Institute. And what I found out was that I was not so much dealing with a conflict between two things called science and religion, but in fact, what was meant by science and what it meant to be truly scientific. And I think this is particularly relevant for today's debates because it gives us another way of understanding them, something a bit more useful, a bit more accurate, a bit more helpful and rigorous than saying that people are deluded. So I think my alternative framework that I would propose has three major interrelated dynamics at play. There is a directly theological question on the authority and the reliability of the Bible. There is a social dimension there's a struggle for cultural and intellectual authority according to science, and there's a philosophical dimension. So I'll explain the first two, but the third I think is the most important, what we should concentrate on, because I think it holds the key to understanding everything else. So in terms of the first point, what's really important for our purposes today, before I discuss any theological implications, is to understand the importance of the Bible in Victorian culture. Now, this was the first text that many children learned to read. If you read the biography of any Victorian evangelical, if they mention literacy, they will mention learning to read from the Bible. So this was the first text that many children learned to read. Scriptural allusions, metaphors were part of a common literary context in Victorian Britain. Britons, regardless of their faith, could use biblical stories that were as well known as the works of Shakespeare or Dickens or the Brontes. If you went into a schoolroom or a Sunday school, there would be maps of the biblical lands on the walls. The lands around the Jordan, it was said, were as well known as those along the Rhine. But of course, for evangelicals, the Bible holds a singular importance because of the doctrine of sola scriptura. That is, that the Bible is an infallible and exhaustive source of authority on all matters of faith, including salvation. So anything which threatened the authority or the infallibility of the Bible would be sure to generate a measure of controversy in Victorian Britain. And that controversy came in the form of biblical criticism. So biblical, or sometimes as it's known, higher criticism, was a technique in which the Bible was treated as if it were any other historical documentary source. In the first half of the 19th century, it was particularly associated with the Tübingen School of philosophy in Germany, where scholars had applied the methodology of historians and literary critics to the Bible itself. Now, these ideas were first introduced to a British audience by the poet Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but it was the novelist George Eliot who brought them to wider attention with her translations of David Strauss's Das Leben Jesu in 1846 and Ludwig Feuerbach's Das Wesen des Christentums in 1854. As its title might suggest, Das Leben Jesu, the life of Jesus, Strauss had attempted to provide an account of the life of Jesus which was rigorously historical rather than mythological, and one in which the possibility of any miraculous acts was not necessarily taken for granted. Now, this caused a bit of consternation, but it was quite often sort of dismissed as a continental, metaphysical, speculatory, un-British attempt to criticize the Bible. So it wasn't until higher critical techniques were applied by British scholars that they became particularly controversial. Now, the emblematic example of this came in 1860, just months after Darwin published his Origin of Species. Essays and Reviews, a collection of essays by 6 Anglican priests and a layman. And at the centre of it was a contribution by Benjamin Jowett, who was the Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford. And Jowett's essay was called On the Interpretation of Scripture. And this is really a perfect example of higher criticism because, in his own words, it sought to apply the techniques of literary criticism to the Bible and to understand the context of its composition, in Jowett's words, like any other book. So this attempt to find some sort of accommodation between Anglican faith and the intellectual culture of the 19th century actually caused quite a scandal. The essayists were dubbed the Seven Against Christ, and 2 of them, those who could be, were charged with heresy in ecclesiastical court. Essays and Reviews was soon followed by a similarly controversial work by John William Colenso, who was the Anglican Bishop of Natal in what's now South Africa. And it suggested that Moses was not the author of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. So efforts to independently verify the accuracy of the Bible as an historical narrative were contentious because they implied that its historicity, and therefore probably its divine inspiration, couldn't be taken for granted. So to accept the approach of biblical criticism actually required a modified understanding of the relationship between God and humans, and especially how that was mediated by the Bible. Rather than the ultimate authority in all matters of doctrine and a factually accurate historical record, the Bible should now be understood, according to the critics, as a record of the religious experiences of an ancient people. So according to this understanding, God progressively revealed himself to his people, and the relationship between them was now emotional, personal, and experiential, which suited the atmosphere of the 19th century. So that's the first dynamic. The second, I think, is the idea of cultural authority. So essentially, by the mid-19th century, science had acquired a considerable degree of prestige, and we understand that today. Politicians at the moment talk constantly about following the science, doing what the science says. Science is in a way reified as something imbued with a degree of authority. But in the mid-19th century, many people attributed Britain's industrial, commercial, even imperial success to its reverence for science and the scientific method. But at the same time, it was actually undergoing a process of professionalization. Previously, much scientific research had been undertaken by gentlemen amateurs, and chief among them were actually Anglican clerics. They were university educated almost exclusively, and they had financial means, good education, and free time to pursue their intellectual interests. Many of these, what became known as parson naturalists, made significant contributions to scientific discovery. And I've put up William Buckland there, who was an Anglican curate, who described Megalosaurus, which was the first complete dinosaur skeleton. But there was also a new rising class of professional scientists, and they were largely drawn from the provincial middle classes, and they wanted to see science professionalized and secularized. They included figures such as the naturalist Thomas Henry Huxley, who became known as Darwin's bulldog, and the physicist John Tyndall. And both Huxley and Tyndall were members of the X Club, which was an informal dining group that sort of acted as a pressure group or a steering committee to advance their interests in Victorian scientific society. Now, both Huxley and Tyndall were actually quite accomplished controversialists. They were very good at getting themselves into debates and engaging with religious authority, and they actually sought out fights with quite an interesting degree of regularity. Huxley, for instance, engaged Samuel Wilberforce. You can see him there on the left, facing off against Huxley on the right. And Wilberforce was the Bishop of Oxford, and he was renowned as one of Britain's most accomplished public speakers. And Huxley engaged him in a debate after another debate at the Oxford Union, actually by Colenso. And the evidence is inconclusive, but it sort of passed into folklore as Huxley embarrassing Wilberforce. But I think maybe the most striking example was actually Tyndall's Belfast Address. So in 1874, John Tyndall was president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and it came here to Belfast. And on the opening night, he gave an address in the Ulster Hall, another sort of concert venue. And he threw down the gauntlet to religious authority in scientific affairs, insisting that religion must submit to science in any naturalist realm, and declaring that this new class of scientists would, I'll quote it here, wrest from theology the entire domain of cosmological theory. And in a sense, actually, I don't want to say that they did it, but there actually was a decline of clerical scientists in scientific societies after that. It actually quite dramatically declined after the time. On the left, you can see Anglican clergymen who were members of the Royal Society between 1849 and 1999. And on the right, those presiding at the British Association for the Advancement of Science. And you can see actually the drop-off seems to start in the late 1860s and early 70s between Darwin and Tyndall's Belfast Address. But, and this is very important, as we'll see later, that didn't mean that the professional scientists who replaced them were necessarily secular. So there's a definite theological issue at stake about the Bible, its reliability, and there's a definite social issue at stake as well, if those who claim to represent science were able to acquire a degree of cultural authority. That's because, as I mentioned earlier, in the Victorian era, science had quite a large amount of prestige attached to it. And in particular, its reverence for the scientific method as laid down by the Stuart era philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon was thought to be responsible for Britain being the leading industrial, imperial, commercial, and so on power. And in fact, this wasn't confined to Britain. In many ways, Bacon was the patron saint of British science, and that was recognized as early as the early 18th century by the French philosophe Voltaire, who was in exile, sort of self-imposed exile in England, and wrote his letters on the English, or the philosophical Lettres sur les Anglais, as a sort of a pay-on to the more liberal, enlightened British society that he thought he saw. So he thought essentially that Bacon was the most important figure in English culture. So what is this scientific method? Well, put simply, Bacon's scientific method was based on inductive reasoning. This began with the collection of empirical evidence, that's evidence that's derived from using the senses and generally observation. And then the application of inductive reasoning, which is where you move from these quite specific pieces of evidence to a general theory that provides explanatory power. The more evidence that you acquire, the more persuasive the general theory would be. And so the careful collection of empirical data, principally lots of observations again, was extremely important. And this contrasted with the deductive method, in which a specific conclusion was derived from general principles. And I've put up some examples there. At the bottom is the Baconian inductive approach. At the top is deduction, mostly based on the principles of Aristotle, at least in the collective mind of 19th century philosophy. But this approach was also associated with one of the other really towering figures in British science, Isaac Newton, who said, "Hypotheses non fingo, I frame no hypotheses." So Newton, and I've got a quote from the second edition of his Principia there. Newton also explained that speculative hypotheses had no place, as he saw it, in experimental science. And there was actually another philosophical principle that went along with this inductive methodology, especially for British and North American evangelicals. And this was the school of common sense realism, the Scottish school of common sense direct realism. And very crudely speaking, this was a response to the radical skepticism of David Hume, the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher, who was skeptical about being able to have certain knowledge of the external world. Common sense, which came from the work of Francis Hutcheson and Thomas Reid, who was probably its most famous exponent, argued that reliable knowledge of the external world actually could be derived using our senses, because they argued that God had created humans, given us the ability to observe and to apply reason, and this process should therefore be, in general terms at least, allowing for optical illusions and such, a reliable source of knowledge. And since it focused on applying reason to collections of empirical data, this was actually a Baconian, a scientific and inductive approach. So this underlined the inductive methodology. And actually, if we link back to that first dynamic that I mentioned, this applied to the Bible as well. It was possible to inductively study the Bible. Instead of arriving at the Bible with hypotheses, you would look at the Bible, observe it, and then come to conclusions. So if it was also believed that it was possible to obtain direct, reliable evidence of the natural world, this evidence would in turn provide direct, reliable evidence of God's creation. So in a sense, God had written two books, one of special revelation in the Bible, which should be studied theologically, and one of general revelation in the natural world, which should be studied scientifically. And what was contained in God's writings in the natural world and in Scripture would be in complete agreement, and any sort of conflict between the two would be a problem of interpretation by scientific study or theological study. And careful, correct study of either of these would lead inevitably to the same conclusions. And on the other hand, speculation about the reliability of the Bible, as in the work of the higher critics, departed from this framework, and it was so inherently suspicious and even unscientific. Now, those of you who have some experience with practical science will know that it's actually quite difficult to do science, to make progress in science without making or testing a few hypotheses. And in fact, many Victorian scientists had noticed this and had much the same problem. So the result was that people tended to pay lip service to Bacon. They said, oh yes, definitely following Bacon's scientific method. Bacon is fantastic, absolutely. And then went and tested hypotheses anyway. And this brought them closer to the method that practicing scientists tend to use today. So I've just put up on this slide a framework, and it's kind of derived from the mid-20th century philosopher of science, Karl Popper. And you'll notice that there are a few extra steps compared to the Baconian method. There are hypotheses that are tested, new observations are sought out, and so forward. So there are a few extra steps. There are a lot more hypotheses, but it's probably something that you will recognize as a rough approximation of how science tends to happen, at least in theory, today. So in advancing his theory of evolution, Darwin had to contend with this resistance to hypotheses and speculation, and with the privileging of empirical evidence, and most especially direct observation. Now, obviously it's quite difficult to actually directly observe something that takes place over a period of thousands of years, like evolution. It's pretty much impossible to directly observe it. So Darwin spent the first part of his book, The Origin of Species, actually very, very carefully laying out in extensive detail the observations on variation in the natural world that he had made. And then he followed it up by his theory, and then provided several more chapters of evidence, observational evidence, that he thought supported it. So this obviously generated a little bit of controversy, and people got themselves quite excited about it, but not in the way maybe that we thought. And this is actually where the Victoria Institute comes in. So this is an organization that was established in 1865 in London. Its first president was Anthony Ashley Cooper, the Evangelical Earl of Shaftesbury, a famous evangelical and social reformer. And it's a little unclear on the slide, but you may see here the motto that it has is Ad Majorem Gloria Dei, for the greater glory of God. But what's really interesting about the Victoria Institute is that it's been suggested as the first anti-evolutionary organization. It came in the wake of Darwin, after all. It seemed to be involved in questions of science and religion on the religion side. And I thought this would make quite an interesting case study. So I looked a little bit closer, and I was actually quite surprised by what I found. So if you look at its name and its object, which I've got the first one here, and its approach, you notice that the Victoria Institute had a second name, the Philosophical Society of Great Britain. And you'll also spot that it doesn't take aim at science directly, or science as a thing, but it wanted to defend Holy Scripture against the oppositions of science, falsely so called. Now, this is actually a biblical allusion. It's from Paul's letter to Timothy, to avoid the vain babblings of science, falsely so called. But it's an important reminder, I think, that the perceived conflict was not between science and religion, but over what science actually was. True science, science not falsely so called, I suppose. So really, this is a question of the philosophy of, the meaning of science. And that is both the books of nature and the books of scripture, if scientifically observed, could not in fact be in conflict. This is really what they were set up to demonstrate. So in, I suppose, my own spirit of scientific inquiry, I thought I would make some observations and then arrive at some conclusions. So I looked very closely at the Victoria Institute, all its papers. They presented an average of 11 papers every year, more or less one every fortnight during the season, from November till about May, in various premises around London. So in the first 20 years, 11 papers a year, just under that. In some years, there were just over 200 papers. But the really interesting thing is that evolution, or Darwin himself, or the idea of natural selection, was only the subject of 16 papers. So just under 8% of the papers. And the following 20 years, that included a period of time that historians and philosophers of science have sometimes called the eclipse of Darwinism. This is from the biologist Julian Huxley. Described it as this, but also the historian of science, Peter Bowler, has written an absolutely fantastic book on the subject. And this was a time when there were proliferation of other scientific theories that seemed to explain evolution. And there was a resurgence in the idea of the Marxism, the idea that animals adapted during their lives to their environment, and that this was somehow passed on to their children, or the idea of saltations, that instead of gradual natural selection weeding out things or allowing things to survive over time, that there were saltations, great leaps forward. So this is a time when, if there was a problem with the biological mechanism of Darwinism, you would expect that the Victoria Institute would spend quite a bit of time discussing this. And in fact, they spent even less time discussing it. Darwin sometimes featured in the discussions, but his theory itself was not really mentioned as problematic, except when it was framed in terms of it being unscientific because it wasn't inductive. And actually, what most time was actually spent discussing, and certainly in terms of Darwin, was the idea of there being Darwinists, a group of people called the Darwinists, and they tended to include familiar figures from the X Club like Tyndall and Huxley. But if I look a little bit closer at what the Victoria Institute thought the movement of Darwinists were, I've put up some of the figures there on the slide. If you know who any of them are, you'll notice that there are very few biologists there. In fact, the only person up there who would count as a biologist, I think, would be the German naturalist Ernst Haeckel, who's a popularizer of evolution in German. And the only other biologist who was really a member of this group was Huxley, who I've already mentioned. So starting in the top left corner, we have John Tyndall, the physicist. Next to him, John Stuart Mill, the philosopher, and then Haeckel. After that is David Strauss, the biblical critic. And then on the bottom, we have John Colenso, another biblical critic, and Herbert Spencer, a social theorist. And this, but to me anyway, shows that Darwin's theory at the Victoria Institute, it was much less important in what it said, in its role as a scientific theory, than what it was thought to represent. And what it was thought to represent was a collection of dangerously unscientific theories that misinterpreted God's two books, whether of nature or of scripture. But because most of their work was built on a hypothetical or deductive or hypothetical deductive methodology, at the Victoria Institute, they could dismiss it as being unscientific. And actually, if you think back to the struggle for cultural authority, you remember that the ex-club figures, such as Huxley, Tyndall, and Spencer, had wanted to secularize and to professionalize their disciplines. And I'd shown how clerical participation in scientific societies did decline during this period. And whether or not this was down to their efforts, we can certainly say that it happened. But interestingly, if you look at the Victoria Institute's membership over the time, you'll notice that this was a scientific society in which Anglican clerics made up a substantial proportion of the membership. They were generally between 20 and 25%. So quite a significant number. And what's actually quite interesting is, even though this was ostensibly a philosophical or scientific society, what those members tended to argue about were how historical or biblical higher criticism was actually an unscientific process. So that really dominated their attention. Now, I mentioned earlier that the decline of clerical membership didn't necessarily mean that scientists themselves became secular. And in fact, I think the best example is the man who succeeded Shaftesbury as the Victoria Institute's president, Sir George Gabriel Stokes. And here he is. He is the only person that I've ever seen on a Liechtenstein stamp. And I'll be very impressed if anybody else can find another Irish scientist on one. Stokes was from Screen in County Sligo, Ireland's west coast. His father was a Church of Ireland pastor, and he left Ireland at quite a young age and went to Cambridge, and apart from holidays, he never came back. Stokes, as well as succeeding Shaftesbury as the president of the Victoria Institute, he also succeeded T.H. Huxley as president of the Royal Society. And he was a very deep, committed, and sincere evangelical. He was the longest serving Lucasian professor at Cambridge. This is the chair of mathematical physics held by Isaac Newton, Charles Babbage, more recently by Stephen Hawking. But he absolutely and clearly believed that science and religion could only ever be in harmony. He was a staunch proponent of what's called natural theology, and this is really another interpretation of that idea that scientific study of the natural world would give evidence for God's existence. Now, the most well-known formulation came in a book called, appropriately enough, Natural Theology by William Paley. And Stokes read this during his Cambridge undergrad years. And the very well-known argument from it is the watchmaker analogy. And this is the idea that if you're out walking and you come across a watch, even if you've never seen a watch before, you will look at it and notice that it bears all the hallmarks of being designed, and design implies a designer. And by analogy, looking at the natural world, you will find that it bears hallmarks of design, and therefore designer, and therefore, of course, God. Now, Stokes continued to popularize these arguments, and in fact, in the 1880s and 1890s, he was, Britain's leading proponent of natural theology. He gave lecture series in Aberdeen and in Edinburgh called Natural Theology. He published them as a book called Natural Theology, very inventive. But he was quite modest. He said that he understood natural theology in much the same way as Paley had done many years ago. But I actually think he introduced a more sophisticated approach that incorporated advances in physics and biology since the time of Paley, and particularly in the human eye. So for Stokes, the most important thing was that the natural world contained laws of operation, and these governed everything from how light refracted around the eye, how the mind interpreted light and generated images, and even potentially how species adapted, maybe even evolved to their environment. But if design implied a designer, Stokes thought that these laws required a lawmaker. And so he provided a figurehead at the Victoria Institute, which then became a forum where these kind of arguments could be articulated in a sympathetic space by leading scientists, clerics, and biblical criticism could be defeated by science, and the authentic study of the natural world would continue to reinforce rather than conflict with the Bible. So to come full circle, to bring us back to the present day, excuse me, I think that philosophy of science, alternative epistemologies, if we want to think of them like that, help us to better understand the perceived conflict between science and religion. And if you look at even contemporary young earth creationists, who it's easy to dismiss as cranks, but they frequently make arguments about evolution like it's only a theory, it can't be observed, where's the evidence? But if the conflict is between science and religion, if they want to attack science, why do they go to so much effort to show that evolution isn't, according to their understanding, scientific? And that is, I think, because this is a question of epistemology and this epistemological framework, a philosophy of science, because they understand that science has cultural authority. They don't hate science. Actually, they like science. So this isn't a theological position. I think this is a philosophical one. And I hope that that is a little bit of historical context for how we could go about understanding these debates in the present day. If you're very interested, by the way, about how these debates cash out in contemporary American culture, 2 books came out last year that I'll just take a moment to recommend now. One on the intelligent design evangelical market by Benjamin Huskinson, and one on creationism in the public school system by Adam Latz. They're very good. I really strongly recommend them. If you're very interested in the Victoria Institute, you can also, but on it is early afternoon, it's lunchtime. Some people might not have had lunch yet. So I will stop there, I think, and we'll have some questions and allow everybody to break. Thank you very much for listening.
And thank you for a fascinating lecture, taking us through the history there. Can I ask a very trivial question? While other people are putting questions in the Q&A, why is it called the Victoria Institute?
They called it the Victoria Institute. Officially, they said to commemorate its inauguration in Her Most Gracious Majesty's reign. So they wanted to associate it very closely with the monarchy and the prestige. I think this comes back to the idea of prestige and trying to make it a British imperial respectable science. So they tried to get Victoria actually to become its first honorary president, but she declined.
Okay, because the Victoria Institute is still going now. I think their publication is now called Faith and Thought.
It is, yes, and it's a much different organization. I read its publications, and they were sophisticated for their time, but I think now the relationship is a little bit more sophisticated. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, they're co-sponsors of the journal Science and Christian Belief, of which I'm editor. So they're much more mainstream and not Victorian, as some people might think. There's a few questions that I'll see if I can bring some of them to you. The question of, I think you commented about the physical and the biological sciences, like in their representation in this. And Stokes himself was a physicist.
He was, yes.
So is there a tension between acceptance of evolution and, if you like, whether you're on the physical or the biological sciences, the natural side or the more physical?
Life side. That's a great question. And actually, one of the things that I want to look at in my current research project is how physicists actually, I think, tended more towards criticism of evolution, and were more likely to be deeply religious. I think the nearest analogue is Kelvin, but also James Clerk Maxwell, the two really other outstanding trained physicists of the time. Held quite similar religious views to Stokes, and they were great friends. Stokes was actually able to get Kelvin to come and speak at the Victoria Institute, where he gave a paper on how the cooling of the Earth would not have allowed it to survive for long enough for evolution to take place. So I think there may be something in that, but it's something for my next project, and I will let you know about it as soon as I get to the bottom.
Thank you. We look forward to hearing that. Why do you think that there is a misconception today of religion as being anti-science, and why it's so strong? And is that actually rooted in the history that you elaborated, or is that a separate phenomenon?
I think actually what happened was that the sort of political power of quite right-wing politics in America sort of attached itself to some of these religious positions, and people got quite concerned about that. And they didn't want to do if they weren't religious themselves, they didn't want to do the necessary work in understanding why people held those beliefs. So that's why you get somebody like Richard Dawkins wandering in, deciding that people are actually just deluded or insane. And it's much easier, it's much more comforting, I think, for people to decide that people who disagree with you are just wrong because they're stupid. But that's not accurate, it's not helpful. And actually, that's why these debates go on, because it survives on conflict. So the idea of a conflict becomes self-perpetuating because people aren't talking to each other, they're talking about each other, and they're talking past each other. And that really is what gets to the heart of it. So what I hope is, if we understand where these frameworks come from, how they operate it, maybe we could actually have a sensible discussion about it.
Thank you. Here's a rather different question. And you mentioned the only a theory in your talk.
Yeah.
Only a theory can't be observed. Where's the evidence?
Yes.
There are common reactions that people have. How would you answer that to a layperson in the context of, say, Christian apologetics?
I am not a biologist, but I think that science educators and communicators of science could do a good job in explaining the differences between different scientific methods. So unpacking those ideas of deduction, induction, hypothetical, what a theory is, what a hypothesis is, what a law is. And I suppose that actually is the flip side of the not wanting to do the necessary work to understand, because you have something that just makes intuitive sense. So I think this is something that scientists and scientific communicators need to get much better at doing, and engaging with people on their own terms instead of saying, you're stupid. Of course, it's not just a theory. Dawkins actually has a famous phrase where he says, well, gravity is just a theory, but I don't see you jumping out of a window. And that might be right, but I don't think that's a particularly helpful way of going about communicating the idea that he wants to get across.
Thank you. Come back to this idea, this concept of deduction and induction.
Yes.
Bacon introduced the term induction, but that wasn't necessarily as a replacement to deduction, but an addition to it. Is this a result of misunderstanding or misrepresenting Bacon's ideas?
No, I mean, there were a lot of politics brought up in it as well, because the idea of deduction, that famous all men are mortal, Socrates is man, therefore Socrates is mortal, comes from Greek philosophy, and it was very much associated with Catholic philosophers, Thomists at the time. And so there's a sort of British nationalist idea attached to that as well. That's what made British science superior. But I don't think there was ever a case when it was possible to do much science without hypotheses. But it was the idea you had to pay lip service to Bacon. You had to say, oh yes, we definitely adhere to the Baconian methodology. But very few scientists in practice have ever, I think, done that. And historians of science in the early modern period will know much more about this than me, but from what I can tell, they will. certainly agree.
Thank you. Here's a rather different question, which I think raises an interesting issue. It says that conversations these days seem to be moving away from the science versus religion to viewing both with suspicion in today's society. This
Interesting.
comes out clearly over the issue of vaccines at the moment. And this feels like postmodern thinking percolating down into the public mind. Is there a conflict between science and religion with postmodernism?
Interesting. I haven't actually thought about that in any great depth, but I suppose the idea that that sort of post-truth society that we live in, that there's a rejection, I think, of all kinds of authority. There's now a privileging of one's own intuitions and experience about things, and maybe that's another framework that we need to get much better at dealing with. I haven't thought about it in depth, but it's a really fascinating way to come at the question. I'd love to think a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I thought that was a fascinating question. I too want to think a bit more about that one. And to go back to the Victoria Institute, somebody asked, can you say a bit more about the VI and German historical criticism? What type of papers did members of the VI write against biblical criticism?
They wrote a lot. One of the really interesting approaches that I think I didn't want to bog the discussion down in it, but they had this inductive methodology. So they actually went out to try and physically prove the Bible true by induction. So instead of just dismissing the critics, they a lot of them went to the Holy Land, to Egypt. They tried to retrace the steps of the Exodus. There's a really absolutely brilliant paper where somebody tried to account for the parting of the Red Sea, and they looked at historical maps over the time and their own observations, and suggested actually that the Red Sea had been further up and shallower, and that wind effects could have been generated by God to open it, so that it was entirely physically, scientifically, rationally possible. So there were many, many ways of doing it, but I think those are the most interesting because those are the ones that rely on that methodology.
Thank you. You can come back to the follow the science bit that we've mentioned, and that seems to be in public parlance these days with the vaccines and the COVID. It's the use of the term follow the science as a first principle in controversial political decisions in danger of giving science a quasi-political or even quasi-religious mystique.
In very, not to sound flippant, but yes, I think so. One of the most difficult things with that approach is the idea of following the science, is that, as I hope I've demonstrated to some extent, there's not really consensus on what science is. And certainly I don't think if we look historically, you can argue that there is just one science, that there's some amorphous thing called science. And if that doesn't exist, then it's very difficult to actually follow it. So I think the idea that science exists outside of politics is really dangerous, because all things are embedded, all thought processes are embedded in our sociological understanding of the world around us. And so if we follow the science, what we end up doing is just devolving responsibility to an idea that doesn't actually have any grounding in the real world. And that allows people to project onto the science whatever they want. And that's how you get this, as the question asks, sort of quasi-mystical idea. I think that's a really, really important and quite dangerous observation. So I'm glad that somebody else thinks that too.
Thank you. Thank you. And come back to one of the characters that you mentioned in your talk, Tyndall.
Yes.
Who wanted to wrest the ideas of cosmology from religion and claim them for science. Yet that was in a day when actually we knew comparatively little about the universe. What do you think was driving Tyndall in
that? He really was, I have to say, one of nature's most accomplished controversy. He loved controversy. So he looked for, I think, the biggest statement of what he wanted to achieve. And in Belfast especially, which, you know, there's a relatively fraught relationship between politics and religion at the best of times here. He thought that this would really gather attention, and what he wanted to do, I think, was just make a very big and bold statement of how people like he and Huxley, who were in leadership positions in the major scientific societies, were going to use that authority as a sort of a bully pulpit to exclude theological discussion from discussions of scientific naturalism.
Thank you. And we'll maybe take one more question, and then I think our time will be up. Biblical criticism itself sees itself as a form of science. It's a scientific way of looking at scripture. Is it something to be afraid of, or is it something necessarily bad? And if so, how do you explain that to those who want to champion science and champion scripture?
I'm sorry. Is it biblical criticism?
Higher biblical criticism, if you like, is it scientific, and is it something to be afraid of?
To the first part of that question, I think it depends on what you mean by science, and I don't think we're ever going to reach a consensus on that. On the second part, my own personal view is that it's not something to be afraid of. I think most people have come up with rather quite sophisticated ways to incorporate it into their worldview and explain it, and that focusing on those rather than objecting to it might be more fruitful.
Right, thank you very much. I think we will draw our time to a conclusion. Thank you ever so much for talking to us. You gave us a very clear talk, and we've worked you hard in the questions, quite wide-ranging ones across different disciplines. So thank you very much for all that you've done for us today. If we were here, we will give you a round of applause. That's not possible, but do take our thanks. And everybody listening, well, I hope we see you in 2 weeks' time when we have our next Faraday seminar. Thank you very much. Thank you.
If I can just say, if anybody wants to follow up on anything, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to talk more. And thank you very much for having me.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Wish you well for the rest of the day. Bye-bye.